The Callisto Protocol is a sci-fi horror game set on one of the moons of Jupiter. You play as a space shipping pilot who, for some initially unknown reason, is captured on Callisto and sent to the moon's specialized prison, only to discover the dark secret of the facility's true purpose. While it was highly anticipated as the next game from the creator of the Dead Space franchise, it seemingly fell short of a lot of expectations due to its less than stellar gameplay and story. Personally, I thought it wasn't that bad, which seems to be a bit of a contentious opinion. However, not long after the game's release, I was working on a research project as part of my master's degree in space studies that involved a detailed study of Jupiter and its moons. And so I thought it would be interesting to see how accurately the space science and engineering elements were portrayed in this game. As I played through it, however, I also realized that the game seemed to be referencing a lesser-known historical event that gives the story more weight, and, as weak as the writing might be in some parts, makes the game more significant. So to go over all of this in a logical fashion, I'll be covering the game in 3 parts. First, we'll review some relevant planetary science topics to determine if the game's portrayal of Callisto can be considered realistic. Next, we'll go through the game chronologically, one chapter at a time, to identify errors and accuracies in the science and engineering elements of the game. Finally, I'll recount the historical events that the game reminded me of, and analyze some of the references we see in the game. Before we get started though, I'd like to point out right up front that most of the actual gameplay of the Callisto Protocol contains a lot of blood and gore and extreme violence, but I've edited out as much of that as I could from this video. However, anything that's left is included for educational purposes. Another note before we get started is that if we're going to be analyzing science fiction for realism, we ought to define what that actually means for a game set 300 years in the future. I discussed this point at the beginning of my Dead Space review, but I'll reiterate it here briefly. In his book, The Physics of Superheroes, Dr. James Kakalios proposed a rule of miracle exceptions, by which a superhero is allowed one miracle exception to the laws of physics for them to still be considered realistic. As with Dead Space, the miracle exception in the Callisto Protocol is a technological capability to control gravity through the manipulation of gravitons, the carrier particle for the gravitational force. While in my last review I discussed how this might be an application of a unified field theory, the specifics of graviton control in the Callisto Protocol are not stated explicitly, but if you'd like some detail on how this might be accomplished, you can check it out in that review. And one last thing on that topic before starting, I just want to quickly thank everyone who watched my Dead Space review for the massive support on that video, and I hope you enjoy this one as well. So with that, let's get to the review, starting with some analysis of the planetary science in the Callisto Protocol. As cinematic as it might be, Jupiter appears much larger in the sky as viewed in the Callisto Protocol than it would actually appear as viewed from the surface of the moon. In these rendered scenes, we can see approximately the size of Jupiter as it would appear viewed from Callisto. The primary challenge with establishing a long-term human presence in the Jovian system is the massive magnetic field produced by Jupiter. The planet is essentially an incompletely formed star, and its magnetic field is significant enough to disrupt the solar wind in its vicinity. The products of volcanic eruption on the moon Io also contribute to this hazardous radiation environment, since the products of these eruptions are ionized in this magnetic field, creating very intense radiation belts, which are not as nicely confined as they are in the Earth's Van Allen belts. This area of high-intensity radiation extends out to a great distance from the surface of Jupiter. As a point of comparison, most of the ions and the charged electrons in Earth's Van Allen belts do not exceed 10 mega-electron volts, or MeVs for short. These 10 MeV particles are still strong enough to be hazardous to spacecraft electronics. In the most intense region of Jupiter's radiation belts, just outside the main rings, ions possess energies of up to 350 mega-electron volts. So at these intensities, you're going to have some trouble operating in this region. Now obviously people have already been to space and have traversed these Van Allen belts and survived. So to determine the habitability of the Galilean moons of Jupiter, we need to establish what is considered a safe level of radiation. Radiation exposure is measured in terms of units of REMs, which are calculated by multiplying rads by RBEs. A rad essentially determines a certain amount of energy being absorbed by a substance, in this case, people. RBE, which stands for Rated Biological Effectiveness, essentially determines how damaging the inbound radiation is to a person, and is dependent on the type of radiation being considered. Multiplying these two terms together, we get REMS, which stands for Röntgen Equivalent Man. Basically, this determines how injurious this radiation is to the person receiving the radiation. So now, using this unit of REMS, we can quantify how much radiation exposure is incurred in the radiation environment of Jupiter. For this, we have to do a quick crash course on radiation exposure. The safe level of radiation exposure, as established by the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is 5 REMS per year, which is fairly low compared to the numbers we'll be looking at in a moment. In this chart compiled by Podzolko and Getzilev, we can see estimates for radiation exposure at each of the Galilean moons. According to this chart, Io and Europa receive approximately around 15 kilorads per day, which is a bit much. Ganymede is a little bit safer in this regard as it receives only 150 rads per day, which is likely in part due to its unique magnetosphere. And we can also see this radiation trailing off as we get further out from Jupiter, leading to a rather low 10 rads per day at Callisto. Now, according to these charts and according to the maximum exposure limits set by the NRC, all of these moons are way too irradiated for any human presence. However, a Department of Defense publication titled The Effects of Nuclear Weapons, which is quite a title for a document, provides more detailed maximum exposure limits and the clinical effects resulting from radiation exposure. In this document, they record that an exposure of less than 100 rem over an extended period of time will produce minimal effects in humans. Between 100 and 200 rems is also not especially serious, and while it might result in some changes in the bloodstream, this level of radiation is still manageable. Anything beyond 200 rem, though, and then we're getting into the realm of radiation sickness and death. So according to our DoD data, then, Io and Europa are still way too irradiated for any human presence. Ganymede would be more feasible, considering that there might be some biological effects still occurring in humans, but it's at least more survivable than the other 2 moons. This just leaves us with Callisto, which is still receiving more radiation than the NRC yearly limit, but this amount still is within the subclinical range of radiation exposure, meaning that it would have minimal effects on humans at that location. Thus, by process of elimination, Callisto is essentially the only one of the Galilean moons that, at least with current technology, is actually feasible as a site for human settlement. So then, in the case of the Callisto Protocol, we can at least say that the choice of moon for a setting is somewhat realistic. However, there are a few other planetary science details that do not make as much sense. For one, we see multiple references to human settlements on Europa and Ganymede, as well as potentially Io as well. We also see during one sequence a city on Europa which appears to be exposed to the air. Unless these moons have established some significant radiation shielding technology, then they're definitely not going to be realistic locations for long-term human settlements. We do find out later in the game that a terraforming operation was present on Callisto sometime before the events of the Callisto Protocol. While this seems like a good idea in principle, there is another problem with maintaining an atmosphere on this moon. Right now, Callisto does have a tenuous exosphere, which is not thick enough to really be considered a significant atmosphere. This is actually similar to Earth's moon, which does have a very, very small amount of gases surrounding it in its exosphere. The problem with both of these moons is that the escape velocity of the moon itself is lower than the velocity that some of the gas particles in the atmosphere would have if there was an atmosphere. Essentially, these particles of gas are moving so fast that they can eventually just fly off into space, never to return. This low escape velocity would eventually result in the atmosphere of the moon being depleted. Now, I say eventually because most of these calculations are done on solar system timescales. So for a short enough period of time, say hundreds or thousands of years even, and with a continuous resupply of gases, it might be possible to hold an atmosphere on the surface of one of these moons. So while I suppose it's not totally fair to say that terraforming Callisto would be impossible, it would at least be difficult to sustain such an atmosphere, at least for an extended period of time. We could consider applying our miracle exception here to apply a stronger gravitational field to the moon and hold onto the atmosphere more securely. However, considering that there are very few inhabitants on this moon, as well as the requirement for a continuous energy supply to maintain this gravitational force, it seems like the power requirements of such a system would not be economically viable. Also, for dramatic effect, Callisto is referred to as the dead moon of Jupiter in the game. This name comes from the fact that Callisto does not appear to have exhibited tectonic activity in the past, and instead its surface features have been formed by impacts from asteroids and other spaceborne particulates. As far as why it would be worth the trouble to go to Jupiter in the first place, considering its harsh radiation environment, at one point NASA had proposed a manned mission to Callisto is sort of a staging mission for advanced and future deep space exploration missions, complete with some gnarly 3D graphics. Also, I did a research project on a more advanced mission concept to the giant planets as part of my master's degree in space studies, and I presented my research in another linked video. So, overall, on the planetary science side, the setting of Callisto as a location for a human settlement is not especially unrealistic, although human presence on the other Galilean moons is harder to justify if we're not considering very effective radiation shielding technology. And now that we've got that part taken care of, let's move on to the main event. Taking a look at the bridge of the Charon, we see a nice combination of tactile and holographic displays, control systems, and human interface devices. While direct mechanical controls for a vehicle of this complexity are rather unfeasible, these tactile controls still allow the use of artificial feel devices so that the pilot can still feel the response of the spacecraft to control inputs. Although, considering that this vehicle is operating in a space environment without consistent gravity, then there really should be some sort of protection around these switches to prevent floating objects from accidentally bumping them. On the other hand, for a system as complex as a spaceship, having digital and holographic displays probably reduces the complexity of the control system, since a more streamlined interface could be developed instead of having an excessive amount of buttons to push. The pilot seats also have easily accessible restraint systems that can be used in the event of an emergency. Also, on the note of variable gravity, it's nice to see that there are a lot of handles throughout the bridge that can be used to maneuver in zero gravity if necessary. As far as protruding objects and potential impact or cut hazards go, the bridge is fairly well designed. We will also note here the use of our miracle exception of artificial gravity, as the ship is clearly designed with a ground plane in mind. However, there are also a decent number of handles throughout the ship that would improve maneuvering in zero gravity if necessary. Moving on to the passenger seating section of the ship, we see that these seats also have more involved restraint systems, as well as handles nearby to steady yourself in the event of turbulence or zero gravity. There are also fire extinguishers in this section, which is always good to see. Based on the lack of seating in bays 7 and 8 here, it seems that these seats incorporate a modular design, allowing them to be removed and replaced with other modules as necessary, or in the event that the seat is damaged, a new one could be placed in there instead. Moving along to the cabins, we can see that there is a somewhat cramped space for two people to be occupying for an extended period of time. However, this is offset by the large outer room that is also included in the ship, so this seems like it wouldn't be as much of a problem in this instance. Just as in the previous rooms, we see more handles around the room for maneuvering in zero gravity if necessary, as well as padding on the walls to prevent injury from impact in the event of turbulence or during zero gravity maneuvers, which is a nice touch. In the outer room, we can see that even these seats that are built with more comfort than security in mind do still have handles to hold on to just in case. We also got more fire extinguishers around, which is, again, always nice to see. There are also a few plants on this deck, which is a nice feature, especially considering that in extended periods in outer space, plants can be helpful for reducing stress and providing a more Earth-like environment. There's also plenty of tabletop surface, so that different areas can be reserved for different applications, such as a galley and a workstation. The lack of an airlock to the exterior is a little odd, but at the very least the door is differently colored and there are warning signs to indicate that this door opens to space. I suppose this makes a bit more sense if it's intended that this door is supposed to be used for docking purposes. Also, there's a book here that some planetary scientists might get the joke from, but for anyone who doesn't understand it, the aphelion is the point in Earth's orbit at which the Earth is the farthest distance away from the Sun. If we consider the side of Earth that is also turned to face directly away from the Sun as well to be the furthest point, that would mean that it would be midnight at that location, meaning that the title of this book is a reference to the classic film Threat Level Midnight by director Michael Scott. And for the restroom as well, it's nice to see that we have some handles available, as well as UV disinfection, which would be especially nice in the event of a gravity failure and you have particulates that could be spreading throughout the room. In general, the cargo hold could probably do with some securements and restraints, as there's a lot of unsecure cargo that could just go flying around in the event of a gravity failure, which could cause a lot of problems. I'll cut the game some slack on the below decks area, since these parts of the ship are most likely not intended to be traversed as often, but it is nice to see that in the landing gear access there is at least another handlebar for securing yourself. The little bit that we get to see of the boarding craft is interesting, in that it seems that it is cutting a hole in the side of the ship and then using arms to grab onto it, with a specialized airlock to allow access. Which I suppose makes sense, however, the fact that they were able to board without this being immediately apparent to the pilots, it seems like it would be much more refined technology to allow this to be done stealthily. So there are a few factors that go into this explosive decompression of a confined space into a vacuum. The primary ones being the pressure within the room, the volume of the air within the room, and the opening which leads out into space. There's not really enough information available to do accurate calculations in this instance, but I would say that it's probably more feasible for the cargo bay decompression to occur compared to this extended decompression process throughout the rest of the ship, which is going on for a very long time. If the life support system isn't continuously trying to repressurize the front part of the ship, then this wind should not be occurring for this amount of time. So while both of these decompression events are pretty unrealistic, this climbing section is especially so. There's an inconsistency in the placement of the moons as seen from both ends of the ship. The Charon is carrying cargo from Callisto to Europa, however at the beginning of the game we see the ship facing towards Callisto after taking off. From the bridge of the ship, we see Callisto in front of us, along with Jupiter behind it, which means that we are coming towards Callisto from a further out orbit. In the forward view of the ship, we also see two other moons in front of us. It's difficult to calculate orbital positions based on this view alone, but we can probably assume that the moon on the left side is Ganymede, considering this is the next closest moon to Jupiter from Callisto, and that here we see that it's not very much smaller than Callisto as viewed from the ship. The other moon to the right of Callisto we can then assume is probably Io, since despite being a similar size to Callisto, it's further away and closer to Jupiter. This is also supported by the fact that the inner moons of Jupiter are much smaller than the Galilean moons and also not spherical.
You got something to say? You're gonna keep flicking that thing all day.
However, when the ship's cargo airlock opens, we see another moon, which is presumably Europa. This is backwards, as Europa's orbit is closer to Jupiter than Callisto. We also see behind us a small moon in front of Europa, which doesn't make sense, as the only moon between Europa and Callisto is Ganymede, which is larger than both of them.
Ship's caught in the moon's gravity! We're being pulled in!
I have to do some more in-depth orbital mechanics calculations to verify this, but I believe that you would need to be much closer to Callisto for the gravity of the moon to be more powerful than the gravity of Jupiter. Considering that Callisto is only about 50% greater mass than Earth's moon, and Jupiter is over 300 times the mass of Earth. As mentioned in the planetary science section, Callisto does not have anywhere near a breathable atmosphere, so the only way this could actually be feasible is through terraforming, which does turn out to be the case as we'll later see. Upon arriving at Black Iron Prison, Jacob is fitted with an implant that interfaces with his nervous system for communication, health monitoring, and interacting with the facility systems. Now, I'm an engineer and not a doctor, but even I can tell this whole process would have been easier using sedatives instead of this advanced saw trap system. I suppose you could argue that since this is supposed to interface with the patient's nervous system, then they need to be conscious for that, but it seems like they'd have ways of working around that by now. For the most part throughout the game, the holograms seem to be generated without an obvious projector being visible anywhere, which is especially the case for some holograms that appear in out-of-the-way locations. One possible explanation for this could be that these holograms are just effectively controlled hallucinations produced by the core implant. Generally speaking, the interior design of Black Iron Prison is a lot more sensible than we would see in, say, the Ishimura in Dead Space. Since this facility is built on the surface of Callisto, it doesn't need to worry about variable gravity situations. While the facility is very harsh and industrial in design, it does make more sense considering this is a prison complex. Even today in the 21st century, the usefulness of robots in space exploration has been proven time and time again. Especially in the vicinity of Jupiter, the reduced susceptibility to radiation allows them to be less prone to damage from these environmental effects, compared to humans anyways. They can also be equipped with enhanced perception capabilities compared to humans, although that doesn't really seem to always be the case in this game, but whatever, as well as high strength for industrial applications for moving heavy objects or assembling large construction components. In this particular instance, the humanoid design of the robots enables compatibility with existing systems so that they are able to maneuver around the facilities without needing their own accommodations. And of course, for use in a prison system, given their high strength and resiliency, these robots would prove to be an effective security measure as well. It's nice to see that throughout the facility we see a lot more warning signs and focus on safety and never mind. These Giant fans are just the exact opposite of that. Hazardous spinning metal blades at high speeds in a place where somebody could just fall into them. This just makes absolutely no sense from a safety perspective. Same thing goes for these spikes on the wall. Yes, I know spikes are a classic video game level design element, but come on, these are all over the facility and they don't seem to serve any reasonable purpose. Like, this is just blatant disregard for safety. The gravity restraint projector, better known as the grip for obvious reasons, acts as a directional gravity field generator that can be used to attract or repel massive objects through the generation of a gravity field. As mentioned, this is utilizing our miracle exception of artificial gravity, and apparently is based on the manipulation of gravitons. And yes, this is clearly based on the kinesis module from Dead Space, but it's more of a superpower version of it. Also, it's convenient that this door swings open compared to the other doors we've seen so far that mostly slide to open. The terms and conditions in the prisoner intake region don't appear to be written with complete sentences, or at least not logical ones, which I have to think could be some grounds for legal contest, but one, I'm not a lawyer, and two, I think we're probably past the point of legality at this stage of the game. And while it may not be as hazardous as those fans we saw earlier, these heat sinks along the walls are still an obvious hazard in case anyone were to fall into them. The weapons in the Callisto Protocol are produced via additive manufacturing using specialized 3D printers. The printing mechanism employed here most closely resembles a type of directed energy deposition 3D printing. In this case, something like laser powder forming or laser engineered net shaping. This advanced printing technique deposits a metallic powder at the location of the print, which is then melted by a laser at that location. This technique is capable of very high accuracy and is used in aerospace and research applications for very precise manufacturing operations. Due to the complexity of the material interactions involved, the build volume is often filled with an inert gas or evacuated to reduce oxidation and chemical reactions. The reforged printers in the Callisto Protocol then do actually have a basis in reality. Although they print extremely quickly, this is probably just an optimization for gameplay purposes. Although 200 years of technological advancement might make this more realistic. Printing the circuitry required for the grip upgrades is a bit more of a stretch for this type of machine. However, there is some basis for this in micro cold spray technology, in which a metallic powder is laid down onto a substrate, which could be used to form circuitry. However, the ability of these machines to print health gel doesn't make as much sense. Oh, it's nice to see it's been a long time since somebody fell into one of those fans. Strangely enough, this game apparently was originally intended to be set in the PUBG universe, which I did not know until researching for this video, so apparently this is a bit of an Easter egg. Just as a quick comment on the gameplay here, I suppose that having a small inventory does make sense for this situation, but it is still a little bit annoying from a gameplay perspective. Now, it is nice to see that there is some sort of fall prevention around these ladders throughout the facility. However, apparently these are no longer considered OSHA compliant. But clearly, as we saw by those fans and spikes earlier, safety is just a facade in this facility anyways, so it doesn't really seem to matter that much. Since it's kind of hard to tell how fast or far we're falling on this elevator, let's just say it's pretty lucky that this landing was survivable. While it might make for a cool visual, the design of the secure housing unit, or SHU, doesn't seem very practical from an architectural perspective. If you're really concerned about prisoners escaping from a box over a pit in a prison on a moon at Jupiter, then sure, it might be effective at preventing that from happening. And fortunately enough for Callisto, we don't have to worry about seismic activity destabilizing the structure. But actually building and maintaining this sort of thing is going to be quite difficult, I imagine. Not to mention any safety concerns with actually accessing this place. As we come to find out later, though, dropping this thing into a pit could be an effective way of destroying evidence of whatever took place inside the SHU. So because we just had to have this sort of turret rotation system for the cell block storage, we have to have this giant drive shaft room to rotate everything, which also happens to be one of the primary entrance points to the SHU. And of course, since nobody cares about safety here apparently, there are no guards whatsoever around these rotating, high-speed, giant machines. I mean, some of these drive shafts don't even look like they're functional even. They're just designed to be hazardous. Oh, but at least we have warning signs about not smoking and wearing a helmet. That'll make a difference. Oh, and of course the doors don't open until the power is fully restored for some reason. I mean, come on, this isn't even pretending to be realistic at this point. It sure is convenient that the cell door electronics are located inside the cell itself. Another common trend we see throughout Black Iron Prison is maintenance walkway areas tend to not be very walkable, requiring shimmying and mantling and crouching to access some of the more recessed systems. At least for critical systems, these areas should be more easily accessible than having to crawl through the back rooms to actually access them. As previously discussed in the Planetary Science section, Jupiter here appears much larger than it actually would from the surface of Callisto, although it does make for a nice visual set piece. So often in science fiction we see these big applications of wild new technologies like anti-gravity, but rarely do we actually see the sort of day-to-day smaller benefits that could be offered by this advanced technology, which is why I really appreciate the inclusion of these crates. As with any proper space station or planetary settlement, water preservation and recycling will be important, so it makes sense there be a huge water purification center in this facility. Although, considering that Callisto is likely to harbor water ice, the challenge of a continuous water supply could be less of a concern than other drier moons. I originally thought these solenoid valve displays were using hexadecimal values to display some sort of information about their valve status, but hexadecimal only uses the letters A through F, and these ones go all through the whole alphabet, so I'm not sure what sort of formatting this is supposed to be using. Also, by the presence of these readouts, we can infer that these displays are meant to be monitored by humans more frequently, and so the fact that we see these monitoring stations in out-of-the-way locations quite a lot seems like a poor plumbing design choice.
In space, no one can hear your stomach growl.
When you're in a remote location, your selection of foods and flavors will be limited by what's available on site, and so new or exotic flavors are definitely going to be valuable. Of course, when you're so far away from civilization, such as on a moon of Jupiter, then shipping costs are definitely going to increase quite a bit. So it explains, at least in part, the exorbitant prices of some of the items in these vending machines.
70% of all people are aliens. That's a fact.
I know this is just a game optimization mechanic, but when reloading the double-barrel shotgun with only one shell fired, then both shells get dumped out, which is just wasting ammo. Occasionally we can find these signs warning about oxygen-rich environments. Now initially I thought this was weird because hyperbaric oxygen therapy is a thing, but I found out after a bit of research that apparently there are toxic effects of oxygen at higher concentrations. In an environment with an artificially controlled atmospheric composition, such as a space station or a planetary settlement, it could be possible that the life support system monitoring the oxygen content of the room could malfunction and increase the partial pressure of oxygen in the room. So this is actually a fairly good warning to have, and something I hadn't thought of before. So while this doesn't make up for the fans, this is at least a nice point of realism for this game. This warning about gas is rather unspecific. Like, is this steam or hydrogen? Or something else, who knows? While it might work as a level design element, this deployable bridge and ladder system seems pretty overcomplicated for its purpose, although at least they have a warning sign not to stand below the ladder. In an ideal scenario, you would want to have some sort of personnel detection system to prevent water flow from being re-enabled while people are still working in the pipeline, but I suppose this does make sense as we're just sneaking around right now. This long waterline water slide system doesn't necessarily seem unrealistic on its own, especially if the point is to transfer water from a purification center to the primary habitat, but some of the hazards that are present during the slide don't really seem to serve much practical purpose. Speaking of water supplies, if we are going with the assumption that Callisto does have a subsurface ocean, then this seemingly bottomless pit filled with large pipes might make sense as a sort of well. Although it is odd that we're draining water into this location as well. It's very good to see that there is a manual override for these mechanical doors, and that it actually functions. As with that walkway and ladder in the water purification center, this extending bridge system is, again, probably overcomplicated and unnecessary for its application here, as well as also posing a fall hazard. It's a bit odd that the tram security station is physically so far away from the actual tram station. It seems like they would want them to be closer together. As we see on Earth, plants are an essential part of a sustainable and renewable ecosystem for supporting a human presence in space, especially for the purposes of oxygen and food production. Like Earth, however, different plants require different environments to grow. Coniferous trees are generally hardier in cooler temperatures, and as a result may not require as much environmental thermal control as the smaller plants and microgreens grown in the hydroponics section. The hydroponics grow chambers we see here incorporate a clever space-saving design, which makes me think if they wanted to, they could fit more of these into the dome. Okay, I get by now that these hazardous spinning objects are intentional game designs, but if you're wanting this to be actually believable at all, you have to have some sort of protection around these things. Nobody's going to actually build a wood chipper right on a walkable surface with no protection that you could just fall into and get wood chipped. As similar as the weather is, this isn't Fargo. Coming back to the space setting realism bit, it seems that they have a pretty substantial lumber operation going on in this habitat dome. This is rather odd, as there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of wood furniture throughout this whole facility, so it doesn't seem like they're really using it on site very much. Alternatively, it could be intended for export. However, if you're going to be planting enough trees to be chopping them down instead of keeping them for oxygen production, I would imagine you would need a larger facility for growing trees than just a single habitat, which is also doubling its oxygen production. So while lumber production in the Jovian system might be valuable, it would make more sense to have it in a larger, dedicated facility, and perhaps on a more populous moon as well, where shipping costs would be reduced. Now, while the presence of this lumber facility might not make much sense in terms of space economics, I do have another possible explanation, which I will cover in the history section of this review. As we saw at the beginning of the game, Callisto has apparently been terraformed sufficiently such that it's possible for a human to survive in its atmosphere for at least a short period of time without a mask, which implies that its atmospheric pressure is closer to that of Earth. If that's the case, then there shouldn't be a very high pressure differential between the interior and exterior of the habitat, and so when depressurizing, we would have nowhere near this much airflow that would launch everybody out of the airlock. And as we were just talking about, this scene also implies that it is possible to breathe the atmosphere of Callisto for a short period of time. Just for a brief discussion of the spacesuits here, the suits seem more likely to be using some sort of air filtration system to make the exterior atmosphere breathable, as opposed to a built-in rebreather system. As if there is some sort of CO2 recycling system built into the suit, it's quite compact. Although 300 years of technological advancement could be sufficient for compacting such systems to effectively fit into this suit, so it's hard to say conclusively. These suits also seem to be more specialized for use on the surface of Callisto rather than general-purpose space applications, again judging by the minimal oxygen supply systems and lack of storage tanks. I couldn't find a conclusive answer to this, but I believe that a sufficient atmospheric thickness is required for lightning storms to occur, as we see in the exterior of Callisto, which would indicate that the atmosphere has been terraformed sufficiently for there to be a not insignificant atmospheric pressure and moisture content. Also, at least on Earth, lightning usually occurs in rainstorms and occurs less commonly as part of snowstorms, known as thundersnow. At this point, we're getting kind of deep into atmospheric science, which is a little bit out of my area of expertise, so if anyone would like to correct me in the comments, I would welcome your insight. In this level, we get to find the terraforming station, which explains a lot of these otherwise unrealistic elements of the game so far. We later find out that colonization efforts on Callisto started at least 75 years prior to the events of the game, so some time has passed to allow for terraforming effects to manifest in the atmosphere. Oh, and apparently those wall spikes were essential to the terraforming operation as well, because of course they were. Inside the terraforming facility, we see quite a few barrels of what I assume would be radioactive waste. Even if they were put here after the terraforming station was decommissioned, this is probably not the best way to store this stuff. And if it was put here while it was operational, that's even worse. This large airlock ready room design actually makes a bit more sense if it was built before the atmosphere was fully terraformed, or at least to the point that it is now. To avoid harmful biological effects of rapid changes in pressure, such as decompression sickness, modern diving operations, as well as space airlocks, will gradually ramp up or down the pressure which the operators are exposed to. This airlock room then could be used as a point where operators could transition between the interior and exterior pressures safely. Oh look, a new high-speed hazardous spinning machine without any sort of protection around it. At least this one has a warning sign on the floor. Yeah, that'll work. That should do it. Oh, good. There's a warning sign about intense magnetic fields. I'm glad we have that here because you know how dangerous magnetic fields are to people. Oh, what's that? The spinning turbines without any guards? No, they're fine. But just a warning is good. The low resolution legs on these holograms seems like it would just be the result of a limitation in the recording device. However, I'm guessing this is also partly in reference to Facebook's metaverse avatars that for the longest time did not have legs, because apparently they were just too difficult to program. And of course, the classic "corporation is not responsible if you die" statement. Have to have some of those around. While I can't tell what material these tires are made out of, they don't much look like winter tires, which you would really want to use in a vehicle that's driving out in the snow.
Vital signal. Human immobilized.
Apparently, these robots are using some sort of dial-up internet, which would explain some of their shortcomings. Well, it's not clear if this transit map is entirely to scale. It appears that the original Arcus colony on Callisto was built underground. This actually makes a lot of sense for the purposes of radiation shielding, as the lunar material would reduce radiation exposure to more manageable levels. You know, even if that helmet's busted, it could still be nice protection for your head going forward. Just saying. These portable rebreathers we see in the old colony would be useful to have for prospecting operations in case pockets of harmful gas are exposed, or they could perhaps have been used as basic life support systems for traveling outside of controlled environments. Although, still for 200 years in the future, it does seem pretty bulky. Alright, I know I said a lot about spikes already, but they're also present in the colony, and I just have to point that out, that it doesn't make any more sense here than it does in the new colony. A lot of the signage in the old colony uses a font inspired by Cyrillic lettering. While this definitely helps provide a sort of Soviet space program era feel to the posters and signs, they also very annoyingly misuse Cyrillic letters in place of similarly shaped Latin characters. Which, sure, maybe this looks cool, but blin is it hard to read if you know the Cyrillic alphabet. Upon flipping the circuit breaker switches, we see that the cables they are connected to start glowing orange as electricity starts flowing through them. While this does make sense, realistically, the whole wire would start glowing almost instantaneously, as electrons are traveling through the wire much faster than can be seen here. And as a result, the heat dissipated by inefficiencies in the wire would be spread out through essentially the entire cable all at once. The fusion power reactors used in this power station most closely resemble some form of tokamak reactor, generally considered to be one of the more feasible fusion reactor designs for outputting net power. Today, at least, these are extremely complex machines, and so it's quite impressive that in the future they're able to last for at least 75 years down here without maintenance. However, fusion power makes perfect sense for power generation in a remote colony such as this, as even a small amount of fuel can be used to produce a very large amount of electrical power. It has also been theorized that it may be possible to acquire some of this nuclear fusion fuel from the atmosphere of Jupiter. I bet somebody should do some research on that. To get to Arcus Station, we end up riding this tunnel bore backwards through the tunnel that it's already dug. So going faster this way does make sense, but the speed at which it's able to transport, it seems a little excessive for a device that's just designed to drill in one direction. Unless this was also intended for transportation, in which case they could have factored that into the design of the platform a bit more. Finally, it's nice to see somebody thought to include outhouses in the service tunnel. Alright, I know we're going with the whole evil corporation abusing its workers and not caring about human rights angle of this game, but this old colony design is just ridiculous. With a whole mess of buildings that are built out of prefabs that are basically corrugated steel that you could find on Earth today. Now, if this was set on Earth, it might make more sense, but considering that you're out on a moon of Jupiter with a wide range of very hazardous conditions, there's basically no concern for safety or life support or any sort of preservation of life in this area. Heck, Black Iron Prison is probably better living conditions than this, which maybe that's some sort of point they're trying to make, but it's just too much to maintain the immersion. Giving this the most generous interpretation, as in the most evil corporation you could think of for this sort of situation, at the very least, this place should be more organized for efficiency, as it's such a maze having to navigate everything from top to bottom and actually getting to outside the colony. These older style solenoid valve readouts seem a lot easier to read with just digital numbers instead of an alphanumeric code. Maybe I'm just being overly optimistic, but this TV looks basically the same as an early 21st century model. You think there would be some design optimizations over the next 200 years. Yeah, probably wish you were still wearing a helmet for this part, huh? At this point in the game, we get to a bit of an exposition dump to explain what's going on. I'm going to wait to cover this until we get to the history portion of this review, but I will say I do generally enjoy stories more when they are showing you something that's happening for you to figure out, rather than just telling you what's going on. The latter of which happens to be the case for this part of the game.
Return to yourselves.
wait! Stop! No, no!
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Robot Guard, for leaving me my guns to maybe use against you. And thank you very much, Mr. Robot Guard, for letting me escape right after I came to. It's kind of hard to tell from this video, but these sinks have filters over their drains in the corner of the basins, which seems like it kind of defeats the purpose of being able to wash stuff off your hands and have it go down the drain. It's nice to see that there was at least one employee here who actually cared about safety, enough to put a "Days Since Last Accident" poster in their locker. I mean, honestly, at this point, I'd be surprised if we didn't see these giant fans all over the place. And I guess the same goes for spikes and sharp filters on the walls. This more posh section of the settlement seems to at least be built taking into account more human-centered design considerations, such as plenty of plants everywhere, warmer lighting, and open spaces, although they're kind of just showing off with these doors. Even after significant terraforming, it seems a little unrealistic that Europa would be at 40 degrees Celsius outside. Right at the very end of the game, the Warden pulls out some personal shielding technology, which, judging by the visual distortions it produces, suggests that it uses a similar method of operation as the grip, indicating that artificial gravity could be involved somehow. It's a bit odd that we didn't see this earlier in the game, but it could just be that this technology is so expensive that it's not feasible for mass production. I'm going to keep this chapter short because I'll be discussing some of the story elements revealed here in the history section of the review. And also because I don't want to completely spoil the ending, at least not yet. As someone pointed out on the wiki, because of the big reveal ending of this chapter, we don't actually know for sure that everything within it is considered canon, aside from some major focal elements of the story. As such, the realism of things in this chapter could be skewed, but we'll still take a look at them conceptually anyways. In the final chapter of the Callisto Protocol, we see that the neural implant that Jacob has received is causing malfunction in his perception, including hallucinations. If we're going off our previous assumption that this implant is capable of controlling visual perception, such as for those holograms without legs, then this could be a logical extension of that fact, as if the internal software or hardware is malfunctioning, it could produce negative results on the brain. While this sounds terrible, it would have at least made for a good plot element had it been used earlier in the game. These blue-rimmed manhole covers, or whatever they are, don't really seem to be serving any sort of purpose here other than to be launched at high speed using the grip. Again, while this is rather nonsensical, this would also have made for a good gameplay element if we had seen it earlier. I suppose these moving, spinning blade platforms within the ventilation system could be useful for removing blockages, although it still seems a bit overkill for that purpose. Also, it's kind of hard to tell how this system is actually moving through the vents unless it's actually propelling itself using the propeller. And on this note, Jacob must be quite a contortionist to be able to turn around in this small of a vent. I'm not an electrician or electrical engineer, but this set of two switches or circuit breakers in series along this high power cable line seems a bit odd to have in one room with both switches right next to each other, along with additional switches or breakers along this cable line. This ventilation shaft, or whatever this pit is supposed to be, is only secured by an apparently weak set of steel bars. If this pit isn't intended to be actually accessible, then there should really be a better securement for this sort of thing. Or if it is supposed to be accessible, then have some sort of secure doorway, rather than just some ductile steel beams blocking it. The fall risk sign is a nice touch though. At least we can tell they care.
My hypothesis is that the biophage is more than just a pathogen. Rather, a sentient intelligence that has existed for perhaps longer than our universe itself. Quite literally, the ultimate survivor.
Alright, I'm gonna give this the most generous interpretation I can think of here. The only way that I can see this making any sense at all is that this intelligence could be some sort of code that is somehow capable of surviving and surpassing a big bounce event. This is an extension of the Big Crunch theory of the end of the universe, in which the entire thing comes back crashing together due to excessive gravitational force, and eventually results in nothing. The Big Bounce, then, is a theory that once everything has collapsed together, it will expand again in a new Big Bang, and creating a new universe. So the only way that I could think that this would make any sense is that this intelligence is able to persist through this Big Bounce event. Aside from that, unless they're trying to go for some sort of supernatural element here, which we haven't seen at all in the game so far, then I don't know what this is supposed to mean. We can see in this area with thicker fog that the holographic display of the weapon selection is dimmed, suggesting that this is actually being projected into the world and not a controlled hallucination. The realism of this depends on the actual holographic projection technology, but I think we can let it slide for being 300 years in the future. Some more casual radioactive waste containers lying around. Nothing wrong here. Another thing for the electrical engineers watching, we've seen these sort of linked switching puzzles in a lot of video games before, and as a game design element it works fine, but I would be curious to see if anybody has any experience with a real-world system that operates in this sort of linked switching fashion, especially in ways that require a lot of puzzling to actually reset. As a general observation on user-friendliness, this doesn't seem very well optimized, and you could at least have a key lying around for explaining how these switches are supposed to be operated. I'd say at this stage of the game it's a little late to be starting with references to classic literature, but looking back I suppose it does work here. The data logs we collect during this level explain that apparently it was the Illuminati who was responsible for everything that happens in the Callisto Protocol, which honestly just seems kind of like lazy writing at this point. Deus Ex did it well, Hitman did it well, but here it seems like they're just throwing it in at the last minute to try to explain everything that's been done so far. There's also some references here to the Most Dangerous Game and Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, I guess, but again, it seems like too little too late to actually pull the story together at this stage of the game. In addition to being blatantly unsafe, these fans don't seem to be doing a good job of ventilating this room, which kind of is the point of a fan. Alright, there's a lot of scientific stuff to break down in this data drive number 6 that we find here. First off, a helium-3 mining facility on the Earth's moon does actually make a lot of sense, as it's one of the more feasible means of collecting nuclear fusion fuel for fusion propulsion systems. The other being atmospheric harvesting, which I've mentioned a few times by now. The surface of the moon collects helium-3 from the solar wind, and while in very small concentrations, this is a relatively close location in the solar system from which the valuable helium-3 could be collected. We then see that a few decades later, Martian colonization began and spectacularly failed, due to some unspecified reason. This line seems to imply that they just made this plot point to write out artificial general intelligence in this story, but they also mentioned that the planet then became uninhabitable for the next 6,000 years, which the only thing I could think of that this could mean is that there is radioactive fallout from nuclear detonations that has an extremely long half-life. I'm not sure exactly what radioactive isotope this could be referring to, but one potential example of this that I found was carbon-14, the concentration of which was steadily increasing in the atmosphere from the beginning of nuclear weapons testing up to the Partial Test Ban Treaty. Following this unspecified disaster at Mars, we then see that space colonization efforts continued throughout the Jovian system, which, as mentioned in the planetary science part of this review, is not a conducive place for human life. We could argue that they could just have effective radiation shielding measures, but then that would nullify the 6,000 years of uninhabitability on Mars. Even for atmospheric harvesting of nuclear fusion fuel, Jupiter is not the best place for this sort of thing anyways, and the other giant planets are also potential options for this sort of operation, which again was the subject of one of my most recent research projects. So yeah, the writing seems to have taken a turn for the worse here. This droid factory room seems to be made as more of a homage to Star Wars than being a realistic example of an assembly line robot production facility. I suppose these exposed furnaces could be used for heat treating of the final product, but they're also out in the open where people could walk by and be injured from heat exposure. There's also these mechanical arms that are just giving each robot a quick spray of something instead of a complete coating of whatever it might be, which seems a bit odd. On the subject of odd robotics choices, while the concept of modifying or augmenting the human body with mechanical components is at least understandable, the biorobot implementation of this seems like it wasn't really well thought out, as it's basically trying to stuff a human into the security robot frame, instead of more logically trying to enhance the human body itself. Even though we don't see it before final transmission, the kinetic hammer is described as being issued to all Black Iron security personnel. I'm guessing this is just a typo as they copied over the description from the baton. To play nice with YouTube, I won't show it here, but I'll just say that this is a really underwhelming way to get rid of a main or secondary character. And finally, without completely spoiling the ending, I will say that it uses one of the main plot points from the movie's source code, which works pretty well considering the neural implant's ability to alter perception. And with that, we'll close out the gameplay portion of this review. Personally, I thought the Final Transmission had a lot of improvements over the base game, especially in terms of gameplay, although there were some weird story elements that didn't make a lot of sense, and I really wish they had used the altered perception plot points in more places during the base game. But now, having finished this part of the review, we can now move on to the section on history. In this section of the review, we'll be going over some historical records that appear to be at least in part the basis for some elements of the setting of the Callisto Protocol. Just to put this out there right up front, this section is pretty heavy, so if you'd rather skip this, then I totally understand, and no hard feelings.
Are you sure you really want to?
Yes!
Do you wish?
What did you do to me?
Gave you what you wanted. The curse of knowledge.
Now, I don't know that this is specifically what the developers were going off of when writing the story of the Callisto Protocol, but during my playthrough I noticed enough similarities that this was the first thing that I thought of. Also, as with anything having to do with historical record, I definitely encourage you to do your own research, as I'm an engineer and not a trained historian. So make sure we're all on the same page, and as a point of reference for this section, let's quickly review the story of the Callisto Protocol. And this is the spoilers section I was talking about, so I am going to have to spoil the whole thing, FYI. By the year 2245, Callisto had been colonized as part of a mining operation on the Jovian moon. Upon reaching the subsurface ocean of Callisto, an alien lifeform was discovered. Upon exposure to this creature, however, sickness and death occurred in the colony and it was abandoned. 75 years later, the United Jupiter Company constructed a prison facility on Callisto. As is revealed later in the story, however, this prison was simply a front for human experimentation in an attempt to use the previously discovered alien life form to augment or strengthen the human biology. Prisoners would be brought to the Black Iron Prison for use in these experiments to attempt to meld the alien and human biologies together into a new ultimate survivor. On at least one occasion, these alien pathogens were released into civilized areas on Europa to investigate their effects on a human population. Not long after the test on Europa, this was repeated in Black Iron Prison on Callisto. The warden decided to release samples of the alien biology, which began transforming its inmates into the monstrosities we see in the game. By the end of the game, the entire facility was destroyed, along with the evidence of what had taken place, with the warden presumed to have escaped alive. However, one of the doctors who performed these experiments managed to record her confession and upload it to another survivor who escaped the facility, and presumably blew the lid off the whole operation. So that's the story of the Callisto Protocol, which is fictional, but just keep this in mind for this next bit, which is a historical record of something that happened on Earth. Also, I do just want to apologize ahead of time, as I probably have mispronounced some names in this section. In the 1930s, the Empire of Japan invaded and occupied the Manchuria region of China. After securing this region, which then became known as Manchukuo, a biological weapons research program was begun in this region to determine if it would be feasible to conduct such research within Manchukuo. This research program was run by the Togo unit, run by Lieutenant General Ishii Shiro. Eventually, based on preliminary results, the program was expanded and divided into specialized departments, the most infamous of which was Unit 731. The primary facilities of Unit 731 were constructed in and near the city of Harbin. Officially, this unit was known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Department. However, in actuality, Unit 731 was responsible for performing unethical human experimentation in support of the development of biological weapons. While these facilities were operational, prisoners were referred to in code as logs, and all manner of brutality was inflicted upon them, ostensibly in the name of science. This eventually led to the deployment of biological weapons and pathogens into nearby civilian population centers. Among other pathogens, one of their more fully developed biological weapons was the scattering of fleas infected with the Black Plague. At the end of the war, all facilities and evidence were destroyed, and members of Unit 731 returned to Japan. Upon their arrival, and after investigation by the American military, a deal was made with the United States to grant them immunity from prosecution in exchange for their research data that they had acquired over the years. As part of this deal, neither Japan nor America would publicly acknowledge the crimes committed by Unit 731. Not all of the unit's members made it back to Japan, however, as some were captured by the Soviet military en route. And several years later, war crime trials were held in the Soviet city of Khabarovsk. However, due to tensions between the United States and Soviet Russia, these trials and their findings were dismissed as Soviet propaganda. Also, of the 12 members prosecuted at these trials, all were given sentences of 2 to 25 years, but all but one served sentences of less than or equal to 7 years. In the decades following the end of World War II, these events were covered up by the American and Japanese governments, until, in 1981, Ken Yuasa publicly confessed to crimes he committed during his time in Unit 731. It was not until 2002, over 50 years after the end of the Second World War, that a Japanese court officially acknowledged the war crimes committed by Unit 731. Now, as I mentioned previously, I do encourage you to do your own research and verify what I've said in this video here, especially since I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing a lot of these names correctly. I'll include some research materials in the description of this video, but I would also advise some viewer discretion in researching, as the brutality of the crimes against humanity committed by Unit 731 surpasses that of the ultraviolence depicted in the Callisto Protocol. Even reading the Wikipedia article is quite a lot. Also, if you're like me and enjoy watching historical movies, I could only find a handful of movies that have been made about this subject, and most of them are very graphic and disturbing. The one that I do feel comfortable recommending, though, is Wife of a Spy, which is indirectly about historical events surrounding Unit 731. It's not graphic or gross or anything like that. It's actually a good movie. Which brings us back to today. Now, I know this was a really heavy story and probably not especially pleasant to listen to, but once I got to the part in the Callisto Protocol where the backstory was revealed, this was the first thing that I thought of, and I began noticing more connections in some of the story elements, such as the construction of Black Iron Prison as a front for the human experimentation projects that would be taking place there, the biological weapons attack on Europa as a means of testing their experimental pathogen, and the Doctor's confession at the end of the game being the only evidence of what took place on Callisto. Another possible reference is also that the Warden escapes effectively scot-free after the events of the Callisto Protocol. There's also the really specific detail of the lumber operation taking place in Black Iron Prison, which, as I mentioned, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense from a space economics perspective, but it does seem to be a reference to the code word of logs used by Unit 731. Also, a bit more in the area of circumstantial evidence, the Callisto Protocol is set 75 years after the discovery of the alien pathogen, whereas the game itself was released just over 75 years after the dissolution of Unit 731. So I can't say with full confidence that this was specifically what the writers were referencing in the Callisto Protocol, but this is at least what stuck out to me. And I figured it was worth mentioning in this review since, rather than remembering this game for its less than stellar story and gameplay, it would be better to remember the historical events that the game seems to be referencing. Because, as the saying goes, those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat it, and by remembering this event we prevent the memory of the prisoners there from being erased from history, and in the hopes that this sort of thing is never allowed to happen again. And on that hopefully somewhat positive note, let's transition back to the conclusion of this review.
I should get out of this store.
And so we have survived reviewing the Callisto Protocol, with all its dubious science and dark history. I personally thought the story was alright, as was the gameplay, and while it could have been improved in a lot of places, it was at least enjoyable. I also would point out that most of the actors did a great job with their performances. It was just the writing that seemed to suffer most. It was also kind of surprising that the miracle exception of artificial gravity wasn't used more throughout the story, and it seemed like it was only used for some smaller details instead of major plot points. Also, if I'm correct in my deductions about the historical basis of the game, then it's nice to see a popular video game being produced that could be used to bring some attention to this less commonly known historical atrocity. Altogether, I'd say the Callisto Protocol was still a good game, despite its shortcomings, and was worth playing in my experience. And of course, if you notice any mistakes that I made here, or have any questions, or would like some more clarification on anything, feel free to leave a comment, as I'm sure there are things that I could have explained better, or might have made a mistake on. Especially when it comes to the history section, as I really want to make sure I'm not misrepresenting anything there. So if you enjoyed this review, leave a like to let me know you liked it, and consider subscribing if you'd like to be notified when I have a new one of these up, or when I have another project to share. Also, depending on when you're watching this, I have at least one other of these engineer reviews up on my channel. So if you enjoyed this one, you might enjoy that one too. And so with all that said, thank you very much for watching. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I'm very grateful to everyone who watched my Dead Space video and gave me such a massively positive response to that. And so I hope you enjoyed this review as well. I also got a lot of recommendations for other games to do as part of this series, so I will hopefully be doing more of those in the somewhat near future. I might try to do a shorter one in the meantime to get something out and try to refine the process a little bit. I've also been considering live streaming a couple of shorter sci-fi games to do a real-time review, and so if that's something you would be interested in seeing, let me know in the comments. Also, if there are any other games that you would be especially interested in seeing me review, feel free to leave a comment of that as well, and I can sort of figure out what people are most interested in. This video's been going on long enough, so I'll just leave it here and say thank you again very much for watching. Also, one more fun fact, Josh Duhamel, the actor who plays Jacob Lee, is actually also from North Dakota, which is basically a flatter version of Callisto.